Okay, welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about music documentaries. I'm David Lizerbram, here with my co-host,
Andrew Keatts.
And we are here to discuss the movie Once Were Brothers, Robbie Robertson and the Band from 2019, directed by Daniel Roher. Daniel, if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong, feel free to come on and yell at me. And we are here with a very special guest, Eamon O'Flynn, of the Record Roulette podcast. Eamon, you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Yeah. So we connected because of Record Roulette. So my podcast is listening to random music from the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Albums list, and that's an obvious tie-in to Rock Docs, and especially to today's the band, the group that we were talking about today a bit, because they've got a couple albums on that list.
Yeah, it's a really good podcast, the Record Roulette podcast, which I of course recommend everybody listens to, subscribes, reviews favorably, all the good things you're supposed to do.
Should I have said we're on Twitter, RR Music Pod. Go ahead and find us.
Okay, RR Music Pod, and we are at Rock Docs Pod on Twitter. We're all doing a great job of promoting ourselves very professionally here. But it's really good. Yeah, it's such a clever idea to just randomly select one of the Rolling Stone top 500 albums, and then some of the albums you guys are familiar with, some of them you and your folks are just kind of coming to fresh and grappling with sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes you do violence against me in your reviews of American Beauty.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a perfect. That's a perfect segue here too, because it's Americana. It's a perfect. It's such a great. Yeah, but that is the kind of concept, and really, it came down to. It started because I wanted to listen to music that I hadn't listened to, and how do you kind of force yourself to listen to new to you music, right? So not necessarily new music, but like stuff you've never listened to, and a great way of doing that is finding what's considered by some, at least, the greatest albums of all time, and just picking them at random, listening to them with a couple of friends and talking about it with a couple of friends, right? So
no, really good, like it. Everybody go listen. And yeah, so we invited you on, and when we do a guest podcast, we like to typically ask the guests just to pick up a rock doc that they want to talk about. It could be one they like, don't like, whatever. You threw out Once Were Brothers, about the band. And I really don't know your take on this, so that's kind of why we're here, is just to kind of hash it out. I actually hadn't seen it, so it was a good chance for me to see it. Andy, you'd seen it right before?
I had seen it, and I recalled early on in the rewatch for this show that I was watching it in like the first days of the pandemic in total shutdown. Mm-hmm. I think it maybe hit the streaming services more or less like right around that like Tom Hanks day. And so that may have played into why I didn't like it at first, because I like it quite a bit now on rewatch. But yes, so it's about a 2-year-old movie or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Eamon, you want to just kind of like introduce this film for people that haven't seen it? Tell them what it's about.
Yeah, sure. It's about my favorite band, which is why I chose this one, the band, and it's about basically their beginnings here in Canada, because I am in Canada, playing with Ronnie Hawkins, and kind of takes it through their entire career together, really wrapping up around 1976 when they played The Last Waltz, which is a iconic, legendary moment in rock and roll history, and many consider one of the greatest rock and roll concert films of all time. Don't want to get on your bad side too early today. But yeah, it's I mean, when you asked me to pick one, I had seen it also at the same time at the very start of the pandemic, and the reason I kind of suggested it is because I think it's an interesting documentary. I'm not completely on board with all of it, and but I'm a huge fan of this band. I'm a huge fan of Robbie Robertson. As I speak to you right now, I am sitting about a half-hour drive away from where Robbie was born, about a half-hour drive away from where Richard Manuel was born. I grew up very close to where Garth Hudson was born, so it's there's a lot of direct connections here for me. But yeah, it's a unique. I think it's a unique documentary for a couple different reasons. I'm looking forward to getting into it.
I think we should kind of introduce, and maybe, I mean, you could do this as well, like who the band is for people that aren't, maybe just have heard The Wait or something, but aren't really familiar with them. Why anybody, what's kind of the narrative about them that would lead to people being interested in a documentary?
Certainly. So I think they're kind of unique in that they weren't around for a very long time. They have this kind of status in rock and roll history as being this incredibly technically competent band, and also this with incredible songwriting. And it's sort of that combination of this incredible technical ability, this kind of being ahead of their time, and creating something that no one else was creating at the time, and also the amazing flame out that essentially happened as they got kind of more and more famous, and as drugs became involved. So if you've watched, Get Back, or you want to see any Beatles kind of falling apart, well, this is like the next level up of holy cow, everything's falling to pieces. But they've produced so many incredible albums, and they really do have this kind of unique place in music history. George Harrison called them the greatest band of all time. Eric Clapton, as he actually says during this documentary, kind of said, I left Cream and I wanted to join the band as a guitarist. Like, this is Van Morrison moved to Woodstock for a time to play with them, and obviously they helped Bob Dylan go electric, which is also a big part of this documentary. So they have this really unique place in rock and roll history, and then on top of that, the music is just fantastic. And if you haven't heard it, then it's certainly something to listen to.
Yeah, so I think we could maybe just at this point just start getting into the movie, because the band is one of a handful of bands in rock history that, like, they seem to actually predate their own story. Like, it's kind of hard to imagine a world in which The Wait didn't exist already.
Mm-hmm.
They also have this really unique arrangement with 3 lead singers who are all great singers, and so it's that's sort of the dynamic, I think, that makes them so special. But it's also that the music seems to draw on basically every influence in North American music, and sort of distill it all into its own thing. And that's like Taj Mahal, I believe it's Taj Mahal in this movie, says that, like, they went to the source. They got to where all of the different types of music in America came from. That's where they came from. They skipped all of the influences and went right back to the beginning point. And I mean, Springsteen says something like that as well in this movie. So they are clearly a band that people gush over, and that's standard fare in rock docs. But I feel like it is more, it's more honest maybe in this one. I think all of these musicians who come on and say, my life changed the moment I heard Big Pink, are not embellishing at all. I think that's probably true in all of these cases.
Yeah, I think that's all true. Now, I mean, I think the main kind of dynamic here in the movie, and also the narrative about the band, is you've got these 3, lead singers. Everybody's playing different instruments, but the main kind of most famous person from the band, Robbie Robertson, who's the titular lead of this movie, and the kind of main songwriter primarily, especially as time went on, was not one of the singers. He's the guitar player. So you've got this kind of like weird dynamic where there was no real front person, I guess, and that kind of conflict goes through the movie, because their drummer, Levon Helm, probably is the primary singer. Sings, I mean, you could say who's your favorite, but I mean, he sings, probably most of the songs. He's the only member of the band who's not from Canada. He's from where is he
Arkansas.
actually from? Like Appalachia?
Arkansas.
Arkansas. Yeah.
Arkansas.
he's from Arkansas. He's like super Southern. His whole vibe is like Southern gentleman. So you've got these 4 guys from Canada who are these like all these musical geniuses who, you know, connect and have this deep affection for, you know, North American roots music. And then you know, the kind of main drama of the movie is the growing love and brotherhood, and then ultimate conflict and split between Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm. And the kind of conceit of the movie, I mean, it's called Once We're Brothers, which is the name of a song that Robbie Robertson, I guess, wrote and recorded around the time of this movie. It's kind of looking back on the history of the band and talking about how close they were, and then, you know, all about their split. And I mean, honestly, I think that song is pretty lousy. So, you know, we can start with the takes. But anyway, the movie itself is just like in some sense, a conventional narrative where it's like, here's the beginning of the band, here's the middle, here's the end, which ends in about 1976. And then you get a little bit of postscript about the, you know, end of these characters' lives. But it's really Robbie's story. I mean, this is produced by Martin Scorsese, he and Robbie Robertson have worked together for 40 years. And this is, I think, really his attempt to tell his side of the story. And he's right up front. You know, he's the main narrator. He's the guy you see through the whole movie. His name is the first thing in the title of the movie. Eamon, as the band super fan here, what's your kind of take on that approach and what Robbie's trying to say here?
Well, that's a big reason why I wanted to talk about this one today, because it is kind of unique in some ways as almost like a last survivor documentary. And I know Garth Hudson's still around, but he's actually doesn't appear really in this. He doesn't offer any commentary. But it also
he doesn't seem like a talker in general.
No, he doesn't ever seem like a talker. If you've seen The Last Waltz, he also doesn't. He's put in front of a camera a couple of times and never says really anything.
Yeah.
But it raises all kinds of questions about who gets to determine the lasting narrative of a group like this, and whether the subjects of documentaries should be involved with the creation of a documentary. Because Robbie, you know, I think it's 2 years before this movie comes out, you have his autobiography come out as well, and I've read that as well, and this follows very closely to what he said there. So I do feel like this is almost kind of an appendix to that autobiography. This is showing it in a different format. And I do think it raises some interesting questions because, you know, this is very much him trying to tell his story. And he was very quiet. Levon Helm, as you mentioned, was very, very vocal about problems he saw with the band in the decades following the band's implosion. But Robbie didn't really say a lot and kind of kept his distance until the last few years. And I hate to kind of imply too much, but I do think there is something to the fact that this movie is, the autobiography and then this movie are released within 1 decade of Levon passing away as well. And there's not much of an opportunity for kind of a rebuttal. So I do think, that's what makes this film very interesting to me, is that it's a documentary, but it's not really an objective in any way documentary. It's not separated from the subject. The subject is directly involved in the creation of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's right there in the title, right? Robbie Robertson and the band, where, like, you know, that was not the name of that band. They were called the band, right? Quite intentionally.
At first it was Levon Helm and the Hawks. So, you know, he wasn't even, you know, Levon the name person at one point.
Right.
Yeah.
It sort of reminds me of like the Bob Weir documentary on Netflix, where it's like, but that one is much more innocent, I would say, in that is Bob Weir looking back on his life and saying, boy, there's been a lot written about Jerry Garcia. Before I die, I'd like the world to know that I too was a major creative force in the Grateful Dead, and I would like an opportunity to go through my life story in a way that gets the respect that it deserves. It doesn't have any of the, I guess, ickiness that I kind of get from this movie. It is Robbie after Levon's dead, sort of putting his thumb on the scale about what happened at the end of the career, at the end of the band. And we can get into some of the particulars about what they feuded over for the second half of their lives, basically. but it's both nice to actually hear Robbie's side of the story, and a little bit unsettling to dwell too much on the way he's done it here. But I'll say, when I first started getting into the band, they are also one of my 2 or 3 favorite bands. I love them. Family vacation a couple years ago, I forced us to go out of the way and drive over to Big Pink so I could see it.
I've done that as well.
Yes. It's a pink house in the woods, exactly as advertised. I saw it. I can confirm.
Is it big?
It's big. Yeah, and it's big. Good point. When I got very into the band for the first time in my life, I was introduced with the idea that A, Levon was the cool one, not Robbie, and B, like some old school Motown shit, Robbie had stolen all the money and was the villain of the band. That was like the narrative that the band was introduced to me in. Mm-hmm. And
I think by the 90s, 2000s, that's kind of where the culture was at.
Because of Levon's biography in the early 90s when it came out. Mm-hmm. And then so that was sort of the mythos of the band. And I always liked Robbie Robertson's playing, so I was a little bit softer on him than I might have otherwise been. But I never actually had heard much in the way of his version of events. So I'm glad to have gotten that. I just wish he had maybe been more willing to vocalize his version when Levon was alive. And honestly, in the 90s, Danko was still alive too. So you could have had multiple band members responding to whatever it was that he was saying rather than this.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of keep, to continue the story, I mean, after the band broke up in 76, Robbie Robertson went on to become rich and famous, film composer, acclaimed sort of rock and roll royalty. Like, my image of him is like hanging on a yacht with Jan Wenner of Rolling Stone, like deciding who's going to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and, blessing people with his wisdom. And he kind of comes off, he really tries to come off, and maybe to an extent does in the movie, as this like, wise sage figure who, speaks slowly and the truth is coming. The rest of the band most of them really struggled. I mean, the band got together without Robbie at one point and had some albums that didn't do a lot commercially. They were playing small, they went back to playing small clubs after playing huge shows. Richard Manuel, the keyboard player and singer, commits suicide in the mid 80s, just after a show one night. And Rick Danko, I don't know so much about Garth, but the rest of them really did kind of struggle financially and otherwise, while Robbie was going on to just, this rocket ship of success. And so I think from that perspective, it's kind of easy to paint him as the villain, while the rest of these are these, rest of them are these, homespun, beloved musicians that, are kind of insider famous. Everybody who counts always knew them and respected them and loved them. But they were, not the people who were, getting the invites to all the glossy events as Robbie was.
Yeah, Robbie's kind of weird because he does a full-on career pivot. He has like a COVID pandemic career pivot right after the Last Waltz, because he doesn't release. I don't think he releases a single, like a solo album for over a decade after that, and he focuses entirely on music and movies and with Scorsese. And like you said, you have these other guys who kind of go off. Rick Danko goes on and has a pretty good partnership with. Is Jonas Felt and Eric Anderson, Danko Felt Anderson, which is fantastic. I'd recommend people listen to it. That album, it's very good. But it is one of those insider, like, the people who know music know this kind of thing. It wasn't a big hit. But Levon's a weird one here, because Levon actually won 3 Grammys in the 2000s and became a kind of legend for his midnight rambles in Woodstock on his farm. And, he did have some success. He did have some struggles, but yeah, I think the other thing is these guys all did have their own struggles with drugs, and this comes through very strongly in the movie, obviously, but they all had their struggles with drugs, and they kind of continued with some of those struggles afterwards. Obviously, with Richard committing suicide, he was an alcoholic. and I think only a couple of years before he died, Rick was caught with like heroin or something trying to get into Japan. So like these guys continued to have issues, and I think that in some ways that has been unfairly projected onto Robbie, as though that's somehow his fault that he broke up the band and then all these guys struggled. And I don't think that's necessarily fair to Robbie.
I mean, and that like Levon straight up says it. He blames Richard's death on Robbie. It's like they wouldn't have been playing in those shows, and Richard wouldn't have been in the state he was in had Robbie not made essentially the unilateral decision for the band to stop being a band, which I don't think that's fair or reasonable to put on somebody. No. I mean, that there's something that makes me a little uneasy about the way Levon looks back on their career, which is that he accepts that there was, quite a bit of heroin addiction in the band, and that people did things that they regret and that they should apologize for. But then he skates right past the idea that might have played any role in the way that in the reason Robbie made the decisions that he made, or the way Richard's life ended up. It's very convenient to be like, of course we were addicts and that was a problem, but also he shouldn't have broken up the band. Where like the version that Robbie tells in this story, where he's basically like, look, the rest of the guys were nodding off and were sleeping all day. I wrote all the songs because I was the only one awake. I had a kid and they were heroin addicts, and so I have you guys seen the Levon Helm documentary, Ain't In It For My Health?
I haven't.
No. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. I really recommend it. Also as like a companion piece to this documentary. In like the parallel structure between what a Levon Helm documentary and what a Robbie Robertson documentary really are perfect. Like the Levon documentary is like handheld and personal, not as slick as this. This movie is more professionally produced. The section where they go through the band's history is like more thrilling to watch in the Robbie Robertson movie. But the Levon doc is like hard Scrabble, like you would imagine Levon to be. But he says there's a part in that movie when Billy Bob Thornton visits Levon during his midnight rambles, where he was holding these concerts later in his life, essentially to pay his medical bills because he was dying of lung cancer and was at risk of like losing his house at one point. And he starts putting on these concerts, and people would come through to pay their respects. Billy Bob comes in at one point and asks him about the band, and Levon basically says that was all over. The band stopped being the band after the second album. And he heavily implies that that's when Robbie sort of seized control of the band. And if you do look at their third album, Stage Fright, I think Robbie writes all but maybe one song on that album. And one version of that is that Robbie's a control freak who had a business, like a crude, calculated business sense. The other interpretation of that is that the other guys were heroin addicts and somebody had to write the music. And Levon interprets it so harshly. And I think the other version of events is pretty reasonable too.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we've talked a little bit about the history of the band and what the kind of conflict is. I do want to kind of talk about the actual movie itself, like as a documentary.
We're here to talk about the movie?
Yeah. Yes.
We're here to talk about the movie today? Oh, geez.
We've talked about
continue.
We've talked about The Rock. We've covered The Rock. Let's move to the doc. As we never said and won't ever say again on this podcast. Yeah. No, this is so yeah, I mean, this is executive produced by Martin Scorsese and also Ron Howard. So you're getting that kind of like level of quality assurance. This movie complies with all the quality assurance requirements. Exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get brief clips of your Bruce Springsteen and Eric Clapton's praising the band. You're going to get all the vintage, great historical photos and footage of both, the members of the band and their history and all the other people they interacted with. So, I kind of had that vibe going in that this is what we're going to get. And it basically is that. It's a very professional production. And it certainly makes its point, like we've discussed in terms of Robbie. But there's, I guess I'm just going to say that there's definitely a lot that I was missing in this movie. Not that it wasn't well done for what they were trying to do, but everything in this movie to me is, it lacks specificity, is the way that I would say. Meaning, the vintage footage and all that stuff is great. The story itself is compelling. It's, but, Andy and I always talk about, like, okay, when you have talking heads in a documentary, like, what you want is for somebody to jump off the screen. Where, like, every single time they appear, you're thrilled. You're like, give me more of this, right? You do get that in this movie, but the person you get it from is Ronnie Hawkins. Yeah. Ronnie Hawkins is like this ancient, like, I was not aware that he was still alive. He was a 50s rockabilly rocker who was from Arkansas, and ended up becoming somewhat popular in Canada. Was like, picking up bands as he went and toured around, and he ended up picking up very young Robbie Robertson to join his band, and then eventually Robbie sort of calculated to replace these people who dropped out of the band with other Canadians that he knew or had contact with, and that ended up becoming the band. But Ronnie Hawkins is like, whenever he's on screen, he is earthy. He is telling it like it is. He's just like a raconteur storyteller, where I was like, give me the Ronnie Hawkins documentary. Like, I want to see 2 hours of this guy. Because then when you would cut back to Robbie Robertson, like intoning a story that he's told 10,000 times in a, very precise way, to me, the energy totally went down whenever that happened. And that was my key to, like, seeing, like, what's going on in this movie that's kind of that I'm struggling with. I don't know if you guys had the same reaction, but I was just like, give me that, whatever 2 minutes of Ronnie Hawkins talking in this movie was what brought it alive for me.
Yeah, I do have a Ronnie Hawkins story. When I went to see Van Morrison actually at Massey Hall in Toronto. So, and they're I assume old friends. And so right before the show started, Ronnie came out from backstage to go sit in one of the seats in the front, one of the front rows, and everyone recognized him. He was wearing a shirt that had a giant hawk on it. So, I mean, it was pretty obvious. Right. You couldn't miss him. But he tried to go around the corner to go down the center aisle of it, and he almost fell over because he was like 80 or something like that at the time, right? And it was so funny because he's so beloved in Toronto. He was known as the mayor of Yonge Street, I believe, back in the 60s, which is one of the main streets in Toronto. But this guy used to do backflips on stage. He was a full-on wild man, and it was so odd to see him was wiping out just walking up an aisle. I had the same feeling. I had I think that this film had very specific goals in mind. We talked plenty about Robbie's narrative, but I also think it made a really concerted effort to cement the band's legacy for people who didn't know the band. So, like, within the first 2 to 3 minutes, you have Springsteen saying no band comes together and is greater than the sum of their parts, like the band. 3 of the greatest singers in the history of rock and roll. That's also Springsteen. They were
white singers
later.
White singers.
White singers. Yeah, he does specify that. Yeah. Taj Mahal slightly later in it, kind of refers to them as the American Beatles. They were doing their own thing off in their own direction. No one else was doing what they were doing, and then they kind of broke up and disappeared, and it never came back together. So I do think that this is very much about setting this record almost for maybe an entirely new generation. Of the band was important. This is why the band was important. But in the process, you kind of lose that, as you said, specificity is, I think, a perfect way of saying it. There's really very little about how the music came together, for instance. There is very little about, the individual albums and they didn't produce that many albums, so you could spend a little bit more time on, especially the biggest ones. There's the last waltz kind of surprises you, just suddenly appears. It just kind of suddenly happens. And that's it. And I think it's it's almost like the first half, it just doesn't seem very balanced. The first half seems a bit long. There's a lot of time setting up who the band was coming from Toronto, and then a bunch of time with them as like the backing band for Bob Dylan, and not a lot of time with them as the band by themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest weakness is like the Robbie segments. Like Robbie's talking head segments are dull. I mean, and you can, he's not providing specificity, as we say, good way to put it. He's not providing much insight in that I couldn't glean just from everything else I've ever read or heard from the about the band. And I think that's maybe why Hawkins is so good, is because he's the only other guy who was there who's talking in this movie. There's some archival footage of Levon interviews, but like, you know, Richard Manuel is just absent from the movie totally. Garth Hudson, not a talker, so wasn't ever going to be very present. And there's some Danko interviews that are just audio. That there's no video of Danko. Interestingly, and then God, I just completely have no interest in the production of Robbie Robertson's new song "Once We're Brothers" and him like closing his eyes.
He's vibing hard on his own song.
Yeah, it's just like, it reminds me of like the Eamon Sorry bit about Kanye putting on his own music and then saying, "Man, these beats are dope." Like that's Robbie Robertson when he's listening to "Once We're Brothers," and it's not a good song, and it's just like, can we get back to writing the Brown album? Because I would rather hear about that than this, you know.
I mean, it tells you everything you. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, it tells you everything you need to know, that the name of the actual documentary is from one of his most very recent songs. You know what I mean? Like, who has control of the narrative? Yeah. It's probably the guy who got the name of a new song as the title of the documentary.
Yeah, I hope he racked up the streams for "Once We're Brothers" based on
this. I mean, you know, the band were together in some form for like 17 years, from when they were like teenagers. Yeah. You know, hooking up with Ronnie Hawkins, and then, you know, playing with Bob Dylan at the peak of his fame in the 60s, and then again in the 70s, and putting out these great albums, and, you know, going from, you know, touring the segregated South in the early 60s to, you know, playing these huge festivals, you name it. They did it all. They played with everybody. They knew everybody. They were involved with everything. And you get in this movie no anecdotes, and I mean no anecdotes or funny stories or interesting tidbits about any of that. Like, in all that, a million interesting things must have happened every day to these people, and this movie is not delivering any of that for you. I mean, he calls it "Once We're Brothers." He's talking about how, like, these people were so close. He talks about how he was an only child, and his father, the person who he knew to be his father, was, you know, he didn't have a good relationship with them. He hooked up with these guys, and that was his life. Like, they lived together. You know, it's this fantasy of like you and your buddies all living together in a house, creating something. And yet it's like, you don't know anything at the end of the movie about Rick Danko, Richard Manuel, Garth Hudson, a little bit about Levon. But like, it's like, hey man, we were brothers. I'm going to make a whole documentary about that. And hardly even mention the actual people involved. It's like, I cannot, it's, the self-focus is so transparent. I mean, I don't know if it was intentionally done that way, or that was just missed, or the filmmakers maybe were trying to get that and it didn't come. But boy, it just seems like a total miss to me.
Yeah, I think one of my notes was that Bob Dylan gets more screen time than Rick Danko or Garth Hudson combined. Mm-hmm. You know, and more discussion and more. And I know that those, you know, Garth's not going to talk necessarily, and Rick is dead, but you know, like, they're just not talked about. Like, they're barely referenced there. Like, Garth was off making music or doing whatever he was doing, but he couldn't write the songs. That's basically the extent of what you hear about Garth Hudson in this movie.
Right. Well, we do get like 8 minutes on a hypnotist coming to help Robbie get back on stage. It's like,
there's more about the hypnotist than there is about the bass player.
Yeah. And it's odd, especially because they do have, like we mentioned at the beginning, like having three singers is such a unique thing. you would think you'd want to spend some time in saying like, well, when we could write songs very differently because we had these three people who were all great and they had different voices and we could harmonize. And like, you don't really get that at all. One place I'll recommend people who like the band, the British series Classic Albums has an episode on the making of the Brown album. And it looks like it was made in maybe 97 or 98 before Danko died. And so Danko's there, and if you want to like go deep on the writing of those songs and the production and composition of those songs, you get a lot of it in that episode of Classic Albums. But again, none of it here. Virtually none of it here. The section of this movie that I think works really well, though, is basically everything from the 66 Dylan tour through basically the Brown album. And it doesn't work. It's not insightful, as you say. There's not a lot of anecdotes, but it is like a fun. It's the fun part of a rise and fall film. It's like a montage basically that you're whipping through. They're going through the songs. There's really cool old footage and photos of everybody, and the production being so slick. There's a few moments that stirred something in me and reminded me how much I love the band and made me feel emotional about them, even if it wasn't breaking new ground or teaching me something new about them.
I think another thing this movie suffers from, if I'm just going to bag on this movie, you guys are trying to find good things to say, is talking headsism. The just like, we get somebody on film to say something, and it's exactly who you expect, saying exactly what you'd expect. So you got Bruce Springsteen, especially in the beginning, and he's like, they all came together. It's, greater than the sum of his parts. They're called the band, man. And then there's nothing. Like, for example, if Bruce was like, you might be surprised to find out that like Up on Cripple Creek inspired the writing of Blinded by the Light or something. Let me grab a guitar and show you. Like, that kind of thing, that kind of specificity would be so valuable and interesting. I don't know. You've got Eric Clapton rambling on for some reason. Like, even if he spent, 20 seconds saying something about Robbie's guitar technique, something that like, I'm not Eric Clapton, so I wouldn't know or observe that, but he could do that, would be great. I would just love to hear anything like specific from any of these people. But instead it's like, and here's Jan Wenner. Okay. And here's Van Morrison. All people that have had these fascinating, interesting lives and have this great interaction with the band, and you get there's no, it's all sizzle, no steak.
Yeah, I'm mad about this. I've ragged a little bit on Robbie during this, but honestly, I think he's a massively underrated guitarist, and as a songwriter, he's a fantastic songwriter. So to have no one talk in with any specificity, we're going to just keep using that term, about why he's such a good songwriter and what's in those songs that's so interesting, or why he's such a good guitarist. The thing about the anecdotes, like The Last Waltz has better anecdotes, and it's not even a documentary like this in the same way. It's mostly concert with like little tiny vignettes in between between songs, and in those they talk about like meeting Sonny Boy Williamson the day before he died, or playing a concert at at a venue in Texas, I think it was, that didn't have a roof on it. It was literally, they just like walked into the building and there was no roof there, and like that kind of thing. Like, that's interesting. At least it's interesting, weird stuff they experienced, but there's none of that. It just doesn't exist.
So briefly, the one thing that absolutely should have been cut is every Van Morrison talking head segment. He says nothing. He says nothing. I am a journalist, so I know how this goes. They had that interview and they knew they had nothing, and they were like, well, we have to use something. So they just jammed it in there. Completely vapid. Van Morrison had nothing to say at all. The other thing I'll say is there's Robbie went on the Maron's show a few years ago when his memoir came out, and he tells the same story on that show about being on the Dylan tour, but it's so much more interesting the way he tells it on the Maron interview than it is here. in the Maron interview, he draws out this big, elaborate set piece about how they would record the shows every night, and every morning they would listen back to the previous night's show, and they would give each other notes, and they would break down the show, and they were learning, and they were trying to get better, and that
and like they were saying, yeah, this really was good. We're not crazy.
And so that's the thing is, it's even more interesting than that. It's he reveals that he was beginning to feel insecure, that they're getting booed every night. He's beginning to think maybe it's bad, and that there's one particular day they listen and he turns it off and dramatically, and he looks at everybody and he goes, "They're wrong. This is good. I'm sure of it. They're wrong. This is good. We need to keep doing this." And that all gets whittled down in this telling to just like, I thought what we were doing was good, so we kept going with it. And it, like, all of the drama of the anecdote is completely, it's like he's told the story so many times now that he forgot to tell it well on his own documentary.
I mean, it could be just the format, right? Like, it could be just that, like, this is like an hour and 40-minute documentary, which is kind of conventional. But like Andy and I just talked a couple weeks ago about a 4-hour documentary about Tom Petty. Like, at this point in the when this was made in 2019, whatever, like, streaming was a thing. It was going to go on Hulu or whatever, and it didn't have to be a theatrical length 90-minute whatever experience. They could have gone on longer, and we could have had the whole story told, but also had a lot more texture.
Yeah, there's, as someone who's like recorded a lot of people kind of for short videos explaining things, like kind of mini documentaries, if you will. I can tell, like, the thing that I got from Robbie often was that it felt like it was scripted, and I don't mean necessarily that they did script it, but that it was so. His stories had been repeated so many times that he was just so comfortable, almost too comfortable.
Yeah.
And so it sounds as though he's reading off of something, or someone said, "Okay, well, just say it exactly this way, and it'll be fine." It didn't have there wasn't like the warmth, there wasn't the kind of interest, but kind of, I just said a minute ago that Robbie is a fantastic guitarist. The rest of them are also fantastic musicians, and I think that also kind of, they say it, but they don't show it, they don't explain it, they don't kind of dig into it. You saying, yeah, they recorded it and they went back and listened and they were able to critique this, and like, that's why they're so good. When people talk about the Beatles and they're like, they went to Hamburg and that's why they're so good, the band is so good because it played every single night with Ronnie Hawkins like crazy. And then they went and they did the exact same thing with Bob Dylan, and they were committed to getting better. And the fact that, this whole documentary, I think, kind of minimizes how important they were as a band by focusing on almost like a broader story rather than how they developed this kind of legendary music that they're known for. And there is a part of me that thinks that they downplay the songwriting and arranging on purpose, because spoiler alert to anyone that doesn't know, but a big part of the conflict between Robbie and Levon is that Robbie has basically all of the songwriting credits, and that there is some conflict as to arranging, who should get credit when someone arranges a song and yada yada yada. But there's just not a lot of time spent on that, on how we put these things together. And I guess maybe we'd only be hearing Robbie's side anyway. But maybe they're going to take archival clips. Why not take it out of that documentary we were just talking about? That's about the Brown album, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like, I guess you'd be able to discern that there's some sort of dispute about songwriting credit.
There's a little bit later on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's like they more or less talk past it. It's like they're preemptively giving Robbie's argument in a debate that they haven't set up yet. They're just, it's that self-serving. They talk past the dispute. Whereas like the Levon documentary is like all about his version of events. And yeah, I mean, like, maybe I don't know how much we want to get into that dispute, but I think it's certain, like, Levon's case is basically, yeah, he wrote all the songs. I don't dispute that. He wrote the lyrics, but they didn't become those songs until we got in and started doing what we did together as a band to arrange them. And that was all of us. And, I guess it's for lawyers to figure out how you parse credit in that situation. David, we can go to you, Mr. Lawyer.
But right,
but
okay.
but
You're,
it's like
you're on the clock.
But like, yeah, I don't know. I would just like to have known more about their process, especially like they've got footage in Big Pink. There's pit footage in the basement. It's like more of that.
Let's give us the get back of that.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Drag out all that footage and God, let's, I'll watch any amount of that.
Yeah.
Messing around with Bob Dylan, whatever. I want it all.
Basement tapes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely, yeah, there's just not a lot about the songwriting. There's not a lot of, and yeah, I do think that, we don't need to get into this, but like it does raise interesting questions about how songwriting credit happens and works and all that kind of stuff. And I do think if you watch this documentary, you kind of get this inside scoop really about how this works in practice, because it really appears to be, you're writing the lyrics, you're writing the song, but there are some very clear, instances where it's almost confusing. Like if you guys know the song Chest Fever, by the band, they're basically nonsense lyrics, and that's very much a Garth Hudson song.
Yes.
But it's credited solely to Robbie Robertson. And so you can see like issues of that coming up. And so that's kind of where some of this comes from. And for a band that is known, their whole thing is these guys come together and they make something special.
Yeah.
They, on their own, none of them were necessarily special, but together they were very special. For any one individual to have, all of the credit, you can see how that would create, especially as that narrative starts building over time. If you're Levon, maybe you're not as upset about it in 1977, but maybe you're pissed off about it by 1997, because the narrative has been the band was so great because they were so good together. And wait a second, we were so great because we were good together. We wrote everything together as far as I'm concerned. And it didn't, I'm not seeing anything out of that. And, they only touch on that just briefly. Like, I almost feel like this, either you need to have like that gigantic Netflix special of like multiple episodes, although I don't think that the band is necessarily as big of a draw as the Beatles, so maybe that doesn't happen. But that's almost its own documentary. And there's a bunch of things here where I feel like they could have been their own documentary and they could have done a better job of focusing in on one thing or another.
So another thing about the band, and this is true in this documentary, it's true in the Levon documentary, it's basically true throughout the band's history, is the entire middle section of their career is like always left out of the narrative. It's like the fence post stories about the band are Dylan Tour, Big Pink, Brown Album, and then Last Waltz. And everything between Brown Album and Last Waltz like gets such short shrift, even though they were a massive touring act. They played the biggest concert ever at Watkins Glen during that time. They during that middle section, you can actually see some of them on great documentary Festival Express. And shout out to our Canadian friend. It's a Canadian rock doc. But like what they were actually like on tour, what they were like as a touring band, where their place was in music during that era when they already had these legendary moments and they're building up to what eventually happened in the Last Waltz. It's like this weirdly untold, unexplored area of rock history. That's quite strange. It's like if with the Grateful Dead, if you talked about the hate and then not anything until they were like Megadeth in the 80s, like, and you like left out everything in the 70s, like the whole middle section of their career as touring acts that apparently wore on them so hard that Robbie had to walk away from it isn't discussed at all.
Yeah, that is a weird kind of aspect of the narrative. It was like about halfway through the.
That would be a good area for some anecdotes, right? Like you want to pull that in.
That's
like,
where
let's hear some stories about life on the road that was so hard that you had to leave. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really is about halfway through the movie when like Robbie Robertson writes The Wait, and it's kind of their first big song. And it's like I noticed that because I like looked at the timestamp and I'm like, wait, we're halfway through the movie and the band as the band is really just getting started. How are we going to get through all this? And the answer is they just blew off like the whole, when they were successful, part of their career, which is, you know, a weird omission. Especially because Robbie made this and he was running the show that time. He was writing all the songs. It was more or less the Robbie Robertson show. You'd think you would want to highlight that. I'm not quite sure why he downplays it, although I guess just like as a filmmaker or whatever, he must think that the like kind of rise of them and then the conflict at the end is more interesting than like the few, you know, 5 years when they were just killing it and making a lot of money and putting out albums one after the other.
But I agree with what you're saying, Andrew, because the you know, this is not a popular pick, but my actual favorite album by the band is Rock of Ages, which is a live album. They were something else live from what they were in studio.
Yeah,
they were a totally different thing. And the reason I like Rock of Ages is because that's before they get absolutely destroyed by drugs. That's just, you know, they're just on the tip of that maybe happening. But by the Last Waltz, they do have some other troubles, and they did actually have to redub some stuff for the Last Waltz. But Rock of Ages is this really special time where you get to see live with nothing else. You know, no one's going back and re-recording stuff. They were perfect. They were a perfect band when they would deliver stuff. It was just incredible. And you just miss that. You miss all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That, I mean, first of all, Rock of Ages totally cooks. I mean, just a great album. So second that recommendation. Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a weird choice. So I do want to kind of like, Andy, you got one more thing on that?
I want to circle back. You guys mentioned the like wish that there was a little bit more about Robbie, the guitarist. I completely agree that his guitar playing is like weirdly overlooked in the history of rock and roll, and even weirdly overlooked in what makes the band great. And I think it's partially it's partially because he doesn't sing. It's partially because of this dispute about songwriting credits and all that stuff. But yeah, I think oddly, for somebody who's so interested in cementing his legacy here, this movie doesn't do enough to establish what a great guitarist he was. In fact, I think what does a better job is in The Last Waltz when Clapton's guitar strap falls off and Robertson absolutely shreds him into pieces.
He just jumps in and you're like, oh wait, just leave the guitar strap off.
Oh,
Eric.
Yeah, okay. I guess you're done, Eric. I'd rather listen to Robbie.
So I want to highlight a couple, you know, good things. You know, maybe we can all kind of chime in on what we found interesting or compelling in the movie. I mean, first of all, I do want to say in Robbie's defense, he never says a bad word about any other members of the band. I mean, he talks about their drug use and other problems, but he's not here like, you know, trashing people. He's a very respectful person in that way, which I like. I mean, he'll acknowledge everybody's contribution and so forth. So even though, you know, maybe passive aggressive because he's making a movie about him and from his perspective, he is not, you know, he's not trying to settle scores in that sense. A couple of things in the movie that were interesting. I mean, David Geffen comes in kind of in the middle. And he speaks quite a bit in the movie. I'm not sure he comes off well, but I mean, basically the story he tells is like, you know, or the story that's told is like, he wanted Bob Dylan as a client. So he basically, you know, used Robbie Robertson to try to lure Bob Dylan. He called Woodstock, where the band was famously living, a shithole and convinced Robbie to move to Malibu, which eventually the band, you know, kind of had to pick up and move there. Maybe that's kind of seen as like, you know, the end of this mythical period of the band, you know, all living together in Woodstock in this little house and, you know, making music together. But, you know, and kind of the beginning of the careerism, but it is kind of interesting to see that perspective and the, you know, kind of the light at the end of the tunnel that I think Robbie saw. You know, of like, okay, well, I can't spend the rest of my life living in a house with my buddies. Like, I got a wife and kid. I have career aspirations and things I'm trying to do. And Geffen definitely played a part in that. So that was interesting and not, you know, wasn't presented in a way like, hey, this is all so great. The complexity of that did kind of come across. Want to hear like other things that you guys that stood out to you guys that, you know, after we've trashed the movie for a little bit.
Well, I actually really like, you guys mentioned maybe they dwell on the relationship with Dylan too much, but I actually really like that stuff, partially because I listened to those concerts quite a bit, and I think they're interesting because they sound so different, but like those, even in those, those are Dylan shows, but you can hear how good Danko is, you can hear how great Garth is, you can hear how great Robbie is. Lavin's not with him during that stretch, but like you can really hear how great the band is during those Dylan that Dylan tour. And I really like that portion. The clip of Robbie and Dylan playing together when Robbie's got those black shades on, he's kind of trying to dress like Bob Dylan. Actually, I think that's like really cool archival footage. I was pretty amped during that section. I think that's cool stuff. The other thing I'll say about this movie is that I think it makes a pretty good case that like he wanted a normal life. He had a wife, he had a kid, he was enjoying being a husband, and he was enjoying being a father, and that there was
they're still married.
And they're still married, and they seem by all accounts to have. Oh, are they not married anymore?
I don't think they're married anymore.
Breaking news.
I think they're divorced. I could be wrong about that. Maybe I'll have to issue a correction.
Okay, well, Dominique is like in this movie quite a lot, like raising Robbie. So if they're divorced, props to them for having such a good relationship.
Yes, but it's not. It didn't like fall apart.
Yeah, but like in the most basic way, the case about him having a happy domestic life juxtaposed against what was going on with the band, like I think probably says more for Robbie's case than like any sort of particular defense you could mount about how songwriting credits should be parsed or whatever.
Yeah, I think that kind of the thing that sticks out to me is, we talked a lot about the drug problems and the kind of disintegration of the band, but I think that this documentary really captures that in a way that shows you how that happens in a band and how that affects the band's ability to function. That you have a guy who, I mean, Robbie kind of comes across as like straight edge, not doing anything, and I don't think that that's in any way true. I do think he participated in some of the drug consumption as well, but
as
he doesn't
look at The Last Waltz, right?
Yeah, exactly. But you don't. But like he, you see how that affects the dynamic of a band and how that can make it impossible to record things, and how that sudden impact of fame and pressure and all of that comes together to kind of make people who you seem so close to just become people that you don't even know. I mean, one of the through lines of the whole movie is Levon. This is a guy I looked up to at first, and then we were just full on brothers, and then we became totally different people, and we couldn't have the conversations we had anymore, and that's what drugs do to you. And I do think that there's something very, very interesting about that. I think that, and this is a very well done way of putting that together. I don't think, there's plenty of cases where people talk about drugs impacting bands, obviously, but I think that this really did a good job of Robbie did a good job of that part, I think, of saying, this is really hard on me personally. Mm-hmm. This is hard on me. I couldn't watch these guys crash another car. I couldn't, I didn't want to pick up
a lot of car crashes in this movie.
A lot of car crashes. Yeah, this is a Michael Bay picture. This is, it was hard on him. And I think he really gets that across in a way that it would be worse if he was saying all kinds of horrible things about his bandmates, but he was basically like, I just couldn't work with them. And I think I couldn't figure out a way through it. The other thing I want to toss out there is just that I think the music is used really well throughout the movie, which you'd hope for in a film about the band. But especially The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down at the end, I thought was very, very powerfully incorporated, kind of giving you almost a retrospective of everything you've seen set to that song, the performance from The Last Waltz, which is such a strong performance as well. But throughout the whole movie, I think it's exactly how you'd want people to incorporate music into a documentary like this.
One more thing before we wrap it up is just kind of looking back on the band. I guess one knock on them is that, especially the early stuff, the way they appeared and also the music, the lyrics and so forth, like they kind of have a little bit of a Civil War cosplay vibe. They especially The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, I think is still controversial. I mean, I think the concept is like, it's not celebrating the Confederacy, but just writing the song from the perspective of somebody who's watching their world collapse. It's an interesting concept, and separating the art from the artist, is always, a fraught conversation. But where do you think they stand now from that kind of perspective, looking back, whatever, 50 years or so?
Well, I sort of am always on eggshells, wondering if people are going to come for the band and point out that the night they drove Old Dixie Down is entirely too sympathetic. If that time comes, which I hope it doesn't, but if that time comes, my defense for them will be that Robertson as a songwriter is great at assuming a perspective and writing a song from that perspective. And it's not just in the case of The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. I think another good example is When You Awake. He somehow, I think it's really impressive. As a young man, he assumes the position of an old man, giving advice to a young man about what life will be like as an old man. And I don't. It's quite a clever trick for a 20-year-old who has not yet lived much of a life, and yet that song feels very poignant to me every time I hear it. And so that would be my perspective. Is that and it's not even hypothetical, because Robbie was born on an Indian reservation. He's from Canada. He must be assuming the position of somebody else to write a song about the fall of the South, and which is and allegedly he got this idea from talking to Levon's dad. And Levon's dad said to him at one point, Robbie, the South will rise again. And that was the first it had occurred to Robbie that people feel this way.
Yeah, I do think that's there's a difference in music between saying something is good and saying something, this is an experience people had. And I think, to talk about to plug Record Roulette one more time. We talked about this with Biggie's Ready to Die, right? Like that there was times where it felt almost like it was glorifying his life and the challenges of the life he grew up in the world he grew up in. But maybe, sometimes you're like, no one's saying that life of drug dealing and murder and stuff is good. And I don't think he was saying that either, but I think it's an honest reporting of this is how people live. And I think they're very different. This is the experience of someone who was fighting on the wrong side of the Civil War. And that's not to say that they were right or wrong or whatever. It's to say that this is the experience that an individual person had. I've also seen that people have accused Robbie of cultural appropriation for writing that song as well, which I think is funny. But I think that's it's exactly the fact that he's able to put himself in other people's shoes and say, this is the perspective that this person would have in this moment. Not necessarily saying it's the right perspective.
So, Eamon, we always kind of end this by asking, if you're just talking to somebody who's not particularly a fan of the band, might not know much about them, would you recommend this movie just as a movie, as a good experience to sit down and watch in an evening?
I wrote down here in my notes, no. But no, I'm gonna stick with no. I almost changed my vote. I came so close, but I think the thing that sticks out to me is this a documentary? No. Yeah, is this a documentary about Robbie or the band? In the pursuit of both, I think it's neither. And I think that's the challenge here. And so I think if I think there's better rock docs that you guys have already covered out there, and like if you want to get into the band, I'd recommend The Last Waltz. Like I said, I think it has better anecdotes, and you actually get to hear the music directly. And if not that, then just go ahead and listen to a bunch of music. So yeah, that's kind of my issue, is that it just doesn't. I don't feel like this documentary knew what it was.
I think for the first time on the show, I also will say no. I think that the movie doesn't do a great job of introducing the band to an audience. Now, if I were going to find a way to say yes, it would be that I would snip that 35-minute section from Dylan Tour through the Brown album, where I think the use of music is really good. The vintage images are really good. And in that section, I think you could give somebody a good short introduction to the band and maybe win them over. But does the movie as a whole work? No, I would recommend not only The Last Waltz, I would also recommend Levon's doc. And in fact, I would recommend that to both of you guys. Ain't In It For My Health. Fantastic movie. David, we should consider doing an episode on it at some point. It was really good.
Yeah, Eamon, maybe we'll have you back to dig into that one. We'll just do every band related documentary or whatever. I'll also second the recommendation for the classic album series. They're available on Amazon Prime. Some of them are really good. The Steely Dan Asia one is like unbelievably good. So that's great. But yeah, the one about the Brown album, just the band, they're like 50 minutes long, and kind of geek out on the music. So if you're looking for that, it's really there.
Levon,
I guess maybe
during that, when Levon is listening to Richard's vocal tracks, he is the happiest person that ever lived.
Yeah.
Listening to Richard Manuel sing. He's so damn happy. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I can't blame him. Richard Manuel's my favorite singer in the band, and so ride hard for Richard Manuel. This is gonna kind of sound like a bit, but I was almost a yes on this in terms of whether I'd recommend it. Just so because, close. I know the music is so good that if somebody's like, I'm gonna spend my night watching this documentary, it's like, well, you're gonna get some great footage. You're gonna get Bob Dylan and. I'm such a Bob Dylan nerd that I almost never really got that into the band because every time I notice them, Bob Dylan's there and then I get distracted. This is the most interesting person in the world. The person who I'm completely obsessed with. So it's hard to pay attention to anybody else when he's involved. But there's enough good stuff in there to recommend it. Even though, I would caution somebody look, it's kind of clunky and there's some problems with it, but I don't know that it's a bad time. I don't know.
No,
I guess I'm going to be a yes.
Bad time. I think that's true. It's not a bad time.
It's not like a tough hang or something.
Yeah.
It's just there's things that I wish it had.
Yeah, just don't leave thinking that you're getting a really balanced telling of the story and necessarily, and that there could be so much more. And it's there's just so much more there, and they're not able to get to it. And especially knowing that there is a better film about the band, and it gives you Van Morrison kicking wildly in the air at the end of his song, and it gives you that Eric Clapton solo where the guitar drops off the same as this movie does, and it gives you a performance.
Neil Young's Coke Booger.
Yeah, exactly. And Joni Mitchell, we didn't even talk about the fact that there's only one woman in this entire movie, and it's Dominique, his ex-wife. And where is Joni Mitchell, or where is Emmylou Harris, or where there's so many other people who could be in this, and so they're in. And there's Mavis Staples. They're in The Last Waltz. Go to The Last Waltz, and it's you're not going to learn as much about the band, but maybe you will, because the thing you need to learn about the band is that together they were more than the sum of their parts, and The Last Waltz shows that perfectly.
Well said. Okay, well, if you enjoy that type of insightful commentary, you should definitely check out Record Roulette, available where fine podcasts are sold or whatever. And what is it? What's the Twitter handle?
RR Music Pod.
RR Music Pod.
Yep.
On
you can probably just search it, right? You can probably just search Record Roulette in Twitter or whatever.
Search for Record Roulette. Search for Rock Docs. Subscribe. Give everybody nice reviews. Be a nice person. You'll feel good about yourself. Thanks for listening to Rock Docs.